All right. Our conference organizers have astutely recognized that the notion of experience is twofold. So this is from the call for papers here. On the one hand, experience is discussed as a noetic. Okay, Skype quit unexpectedly. I'm just telling you what is in front of me. So I'm going to reopen. Hi, world. This one is not my fault. You need to log in here. Or no, I canceled.
That's cool, Nick. Or Nick, cool.
Okay.
I don't know.
Here we go.
I'm sorry.
No. It's...
Too many
Why
things.
can't Nick just watch the live stream?
That's true. I wanted to stay on Skype. Yeah, you go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Right, well, I need to get back
Yeah.
here
Sorry.
too.
Yeah,
Okay.
just...
So, there we go. Here's the quote. On the one hand, experience is...
You're back, Nick. Okay.
Thank you for saving me.
This is a 31-minute talk. Now, I want you to know. And it's already used a minute and a half here. Okay. So, on the one hand, experience is discussed as and I'm quoting again our organizers. On the one hand, experience is discussed as a noetic object to reflect upon epistemological and psychological questions. On the other hand, experience is used as a noetic tool to increase, correct, and corroborate the knowledge acquired in the different disciplines. Now, Avicenna, 980 to 1037, also recognized this twofold feature of experience, designating experience qua noetic object as ilm, or cognitive experience, and experience qua noetic tool, tajriba, or methodic experience. Now, today, I want to consider cognitive experience, and particularly a challenge to the very possibility of increasing and sharing our cognitive experience with others, and Avicenna's response to that challenge. Now, the challenge is none other than Meno's paradox, and Avicenna's response is Aristotle's. And yet, it's more than Aristotle's. It's a thoroughgoing systemization of how to encounter the world around us, such that our experience leads to a scientific understanding of our world and place in it. Now, Avicenna takes on Meno's paradox in his Kitab el-Burhan, the Book of Demonstration. That work itself loosely corresponds with Aristotle's posterior analytics, and both works purport to present their author's philosophy of science, that is, their account of the Greek episteme or the Arabic ilm, which, as I said, could also be understood as sort of cognitive experience, rich cognitive experience. Now, Avicenna raises and responds to Meno's paradox at chapter 1.6 of the Book of Demonstration. That chapter itself is a culmination of Avicennan glosses on the Aristotelian claim that all teaching and learning of a cognitive sorts proceeds from prior knowledge. This is the very claim that Aristotle uses to initiate his posterior analytics. Now, in explicating this claim, Avicenna draws from and synthesizes material from Aristotle's own posterior analytics, books Alpha 1 through 10, and book Beta 1, 7, and 19. In these chapters, Avicenna refines Aristotle's idea in the furnace of his own Avicennan philosophical system. Thus, by the time that Avicenna turns to answering Meno's paradox, he's amassed quite an array of philosophical machinery, which he uses to provide a response that, while in principle follows Aristotle's own solution to the paradox, is also uniquely Avicennan. So let us begin with the paradox proper. Avicenna himself offers as nice a summary of Meno's paradox as one might hope. So I'm going to quote from Avicenna here. It has been mentioned that Meno, who spoke intimately with Socrates about the futility of teaching and learning, said to him that the one who seeks some piece of knowledge either seeks what he knows, in which case his seeking is futile, or he seeks that of which he is ignorant, in which case how will he know it when he acquires it? It's like the one who seeks a runaway slave whom he does not recognize, for when he finds him, he will not recognize him. Okay. So Avicenna next mentions what he takes to be the historical Socrates' response to the paradox, which you may recall involves leading a slave boy to recognize how to construct a square that is double any given square, and its appeal to a geometrical figure. Now, Avicenna complains that this response merely shows that knowledge acquisition is possible without actually showing how it's possible. Avicenna also mentions Plato's response with its appeal to a theory of recollection. Avicenna complains that Plato has in fact conceded that teaching and learning are impossible, whereas Avicenna himself takes it as an obvious truth that teaching and learning not merely are possible, but also happen all the time. In the end, Avicenna endorses what ultimately is a significantly expanded version of Aristotle's response to Meno's paradox. Aristotle's response in typical fashion is terse. So my translation of it is from the Arabic version of Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, which itself follows the Greek fairly closely. I've decided to do this because there are certain nuances, and if we were looking actually at the language itself, you're going to see that Avicenna just draws on this language time and time again. All right, so to quote, before seeking and rejecting or accepting the syllogism, perhaps it should be said that we recognize what is sought in a certain way, whereas in another way, not. In other words, if it is not known that this is some existing thing, absolutely, how would its being such be known absolutely? Still, one obviously knows this only in that one knows universally, whereas absolutely it is unknown. If it is otherwise, then the embarrassment mentioned in the Meno would follow. That is, that either people know nothing or they only learn things that they already know. End quote. And again, this is Aristotle's solution. It sounds a little bit different. It's just because it's being played in the key of Arabic. But this is pretty much all Aristotle has to say about it. Now, in his own response, Aristotle raises a number of points, terms, and concepts that Avicenna clarifies and develops significantly. These include the notion of scientific knowledge or cognitive experience, ilm, the idea of a priority relation among pieces of knowledge, a reference to the thing sought in a scientific investigation, for a distinction between universal and absolute knowledge, as well as a distinction between scientific knowledge or cognitive experience and recognition, so between ilm and ma'rifa in Arabic. Now, since Avicenna's response to Meno's paradox assumes his own understanding of all of these points, let us consider his discussion of them in turn. So let me begin with a brief classification of the most basic forms of knowledge which Avicenna recognizes and their priority relations. Okay, so at the Book of Demonstrations 1-3, Avicenna begins his account of what is scientifically known, what's matlum, by clarifying Aristotle's opening claim of Posterior Analytics Alpha 1. Namely, that all teaching and learning of a cognitive kind occur through a preceding knowledge. Now, Avicenna's first order of business is to explain what is meant by teaching and learning of a cognitive kind. Noetikos in Greek and dhihni in Arabic. Now, to this end, Avicenna distinguishes between teaching and learning as it occurs in the practical disciplines like carpentry, rhetoric, and catechetical instruction, which proceed from actions, habituations, and memorization, and teaching and learning in the theoretical sciences, namely those bodies of knowledge that can be presented syllogistically and demonstratively. Cognitive or intellectual teaching and learning, Avicenna tells us, belongs to the theoretical sciences. So we're trying to understand the basis of a theoretical science, what needs to be prior for those. Next in the order of business is to explain the notion of prior knowledge, ilm qad sabaka in Arabic, which is required for teaching and learning of a cognitive kind. We'll move to that. Avicenna notes that such scientific knowledge or understanding is of two sorts: conceptualization, tasawwur, and verification, tasdiq. Conceptualization and verification's priority to the possession of a theoretical science, Avicenna adds, is owing to the fact that teaching and learning occur, quote, only after there is some claim that has already been heard or intellectually grasped, where that claim must be some first object of knowledge, end quote. That's quotes up there. All right. Now, it would be impossible to do full justice to Avicenna's account of conceptualization and verification, let alone the place of this distinction in the history of medieval Islamic philosophy more generally. Still, what becomes evident in the present discussion is that for Avicenna, conceptualization and verification are the epistemological analogues to his twofold ontological distinction between mental existence and extramental existence. Don't you like my pictures here? You know, the warriors in the mind, warriors in the world. Okay. It's Xena and Callista. Do you not know this? Okay, so this is a cultural default if you do not know the reference. Okay, all right. More accurately, the distinction is between the essence, the mahia as it exists in conceptualization, fil tasawwur, and the essence as it exists in concrete particulars, fil ayan. Okay. Now, as for the thesis that conceptualization and verification are prior to theoretical or demonstrative knowledge, 3 points are particularly relevant. First, Avicenna notes that this priority need not be a temporal priority, but merely a logical one. Second, he gives the general intuition behind this priority, which is simple enough. Prior to any teaching and learning, 2 things are required. One must possess some concept, idea, or thought, i.e. some object of conceptualization, even if it is merely that one is ignorant of that concept, idea, or thought. And 2, one must have some reason to think that the concept, idea, or thought refers. That is, one has verified in some loose sense that something might exist in the world in the way that the concept describes. So, before you can do any science, you got to have at least some idea of something, and at least some idea that maybe this thing could exist. So that's the priority relation here before science occurs. Third, and finally, Avicenna claims that with respect to teaching and learning of a cognitive sort, conceptualization is prior to verification. Now, he argues this point when he investigates the basic objects of scientific inquiry and lays out the logical progression of scientific discovery, to which I now turn. So here we're just getting a sense of why there's this priority relation, what sort of priorities he's seeing. Okay. Now, the most basic, that is, prior scientific questions or objects of inquiry, Greek zetumenon, Arabic matlab, Avicenna tells us, involves answering 3 questions. 1, what the thing is, the Greek t estin or the Arabic mahoa. 2, whether or that the thing is, the Greek I estin or tahate, and the Arabic halhoa. And 3, why the thing is, the Greek ta de'ate, the Arabic lima. Now, all these questions are familiar to students of Aristotle's posterior analytics beta 1. Avicenna, however, further divides these 3 basic questions into first-order and second-order versions of the original question, and this certainly goes beyond Aristotle. Now, while Avicenna is not explicit about the reasons for the divisions of these questions into first-order and second-order questions, I maintain that he's simply appropriating Aristotle's observation from posterior analytics alpha 2 that better known and prior are said in 2 ways. What is better known and prior to us, the Greek prosemos and the Arabic indana, that is, what in some sense is immediately sensible to us or explains one of our beliefs, and what is better known and prior by nature, the Greek te fusai and the Arabic indel tabia, That is the underlying causal structure in the thing itself that explains a given phenomena. The first order version of the what, whether, and why questions involves seeking an answer that is better known and prior to us. That is, what's the first thing that we see that sensibly sort of makes us think about this thing? Whereas the second order version of these questions concerns what is better known and prior by nature. What is it in the world that explains the knowledge? Okay, so this is going to look scary, but it's just to let you see how this is working out. In very general terms, the answer to both the first order and the second order what questions involves prior knowledge. The first order and the second order what questions involves prior knowledge qua conceptualization of what a thing is, while the answer to the first order and second order whether questions provides prior knowledge qua verification that the thing is. Finally, and pretty much just for completion here, the why question is mixed, with the first order why question providing conceptual knowledge and the second order version providing verification. Now, since my topic is Avicenna's solution to Meno's paradox, I'm going to limit myself for the remainder of my discussion solely to the what and whether questions. The reason I do this, why I don't discuss the why question, is because Avicenna's solution to Meno's paradox concerns exclusively the knowledge that is prior to all cognitive teaching and learning. Cognitive teaching and learning, in contrast, requires possessing a theoretical science, as we had seen at the beginning, and one possesses a theoretical science precisely in giving answers to the why questions. So this is the first and second order what and whether questions actually are going to be prior to any answer to a why question. Okay. So the conceptualization of the first order what question, the first what question you're supposed to ask, is the prior knowledge from which all other scientific questions and theoretical sciences proceeds, claims Avicenna. That is because before any inquiry, one must first conceptualize some name or term, Arabic ism, and some statement, qawl, saying what the name or term signifies. In other words, one must possess some positive statement or claim about the object of inquiry, namely how the term is used in the language or in a given society, or even within a particular scientific context, regardless of whether what is signified by the term ultimately exists in reality or not, whether it refers or not. Now, indeed, among his many examples, Avicenna includes such terms as void, phoenix, and partner of God, all terms that for him simply do not refer and so do not signify any existing thing in the world. And yet we do have some account of what these terms mean. In his own scientific works, Avicenna regularly provides multiple possible statements for the various terms used in a given science in answer to this first order what question. And he does so by collecting and canvassing all the various opinions about some term. Additionally, he frequently constructs what might be thought of as the logical space for some concept. In other words, he provides statements of all the logically possible ways that the referent might exist, regardless of whether anyone actually holds such a view. And so, what are the logical possibilities, and then let's sort of define terms accordingly. So here's a concrete example. So for example, when investigating the composition of body, jism, he notes that the bodies are composed of parts. Those parts, he continues, must either be continuous parts, that is the parts that are divisible ad infinitum, or discontinuous parts, that is parts that cannot be divided beyond a certain minimum. Additionally, he adds, those parts must be either actually in the body, sort of like distinct bricks in a wall, or potentially in the body, like the left part and the right part of a single brick. From these two considerations, Avicenna concludes that there are 4 logically possible ways to think of the parts that compose bodies. And now, just as a point of interest, when Avicenna wrote, no one held that the parts making up a body might be potential and discontinuous. but indeed 1 generation after Avicenna, someone did take up this position and defend it. Okay, so returning to our main point, this first order what question involves conceptualizing some rough and ready statement of how a term is in fact being used in a certain community. It provides a description or list of characteristics of what the term means by which one can verify whether the referent of that term exists at all. So it's not a scientific definition, but it's some way to identify what that thing might be. Now, we are now led to Avicenna's first order whether question. Namely, given some signification of a term, one must verify whether the term actually refers to something that exists in reality. Now, as Avicenna says, by this question, namely the first order whether question, one seeks whether the thing exists simplicitor, maljud a la itlaq, that is, whether it exists at all. Now, in some cases, the verification is just a matter of looking. So, for an example from Avicenna's own physics is motion, the Greek kinesis, the Arabic haraka. Now, he gives as a rough and ready description of motion that it is the gradual emergence from potentiality to actuality, and then just simply asserts that something obviously exists corresponding with this description. And if you didn't know that, well, my finger's actually here, but it could be potentially in front of Therese. Ta-da! There it is. So I've proved the motion exists. Okay. In other cases, particularly if there are reasons for thinking something does not exist, more argumentation is needed. Finally, in some cases, one needs to verify that in fact the term does not refer at all, and so is not an extramental existent. Of course, historically, it has always been difficult to prove that something does not exist, what Quine has dubbed the paradox of Plato's beard. Later, I consider one logical tool that Avicenna does develop in the Book of Demonstration precisely to prove that something does not exist. But that tool can only be applied together with the second order what and whether questions, to which I now turn. So Avicenna's second order what question, again, second order just means we've had to, get some rough and ready idea of what something is, have some reason to believe it exists, and now we're going to ask, now, is that actually what it really is? So that's why it's the second one. Avicenna's second order what question concerns that statement through which the true nature, the Arabic hakika, of a thing is sought. The answer to this second order what question, Avicenna tells us, is the quiddity or essence, the mahia of the thing, literally its whatness. Now, for the purposes of cognitive teaching and learning, one must give a thing's proper scientific definition, its HUD, in answer to this second order what question. A proper definition, Avicenna insists, must be given in terms of a genus, that is to say, some large class of things, and some specific difference, i.e. some unique characteristic that specifies a given subclass of things within the genus. Those candidate statements for a term that populate a concept's logical space, once stated in terms of genus and difference, can now function as answers to the second order what question. Ideally, these second order candidates canvass all the possible ways that something might exist, and so pave the way for the second order whether question. So we start off with some rough and ready descriptions of a thing. We have reason to think that something out there exists like that. Now let's give definitions in terms of genus and difference. So that's what you're doing at that second order what question. Simple as that. Okay. The second order whether question involves verifying that something exists as such, maljudan, not just simpliciter. Not that it merely exists, but it exists as our preferred definition describes. Namely, it exists as described by one of the candidates for a thing's essence and definition. Avicenna's procedure for verifying that the essence does exist extramentally commonly just involves showing that all the other candidates for the essence is in some sense fails. So you just eliminate everything, and whatever's left, that's the answer. Particularly, he attempts to show that a rejected candidate entails a contradiction or is inconsistent with some other conclusion or is just empirically inadequate. So for example, in answer to the first order what question, what is motion, Avicenna in his physics considered, as I noted, the suggestion that motion is the gradual emergence of potency into actuality. So it's, it looks like it's a perfectly good scientific definition. We've got an emergence into from potentiality to actuality. We've got a difference. It's happening gradually as opposed to all at once. Everything looks good, except Avicenna subsequently argues that the true nature of motion fails to exist as such, that is to say, as a gradual emergence, so as to be a scientifically adequate definition. For, Avicenna complains, gradual emergence presupposes an understanding of time, since to be gradual is to emerge in time. Yet, Avicenna notes, the true nature of time will be explained in terms of motion. So we get time, motion, gradual emergence. Sorry, it fails. Thus, to define the true nature of motion in terms of time, when time itself is defined in terms of motion, is ultimately to provide a circular definition, and so no definition at all. In short, the purported definition is inconsistent with other findings in Avicenna's physics. In some cases, and this is where it gets just really cool, every candidate for the essence fails. And this absolute failure of justification for denying that the term refers at all. Now this method is the very one Avicenna uses to shave Plato's beard and show that void, for example, is a vain intelligible. He actually has real fun with this. He says void is devoid of meaning. A mere fiction of the imagination, yeah, you know where my puns now come from. A mere fiction of the imagination and fails even the first order weather question. So he begins, just to give you a taste of it, he begins by asking the first order what question. What does the name void mean? Now, if by void one means nothing at all, Avicenna tells us, well, he happily agrees. There's nothing to the name void. It's nothing at all. That is, it doesn't exist. He subsequently argues that if a void were to exist, it must essentially be some sort of quantity. Consequently, the definition of void would involve quantity as its genus. So yeah, absolutely nothing for 20 miles, but at least it's 20 miles, so there's something there. Now, Avicenna then systematically goes through all the possible ways that a void quantity might differ from other quantities, and shows that all of these other ways either lead to a contradiction or have to be stated in what a void is not, rather than what a void is. And so state what, rather than any positive terms, and so state how a void, they never state how a void might positively exist in reality. It's not this, it's not this. Nope, not going to get you what it is in reality to exist. And we think that an extramental void exists. How? That's the point. So he concludes the reality, and here it is. He concludes that reality must simply be devoid of void. Okay, that's him. I'm not always doing puns, all right. So at 1/6 of the Book of Demonstration, Avicenna draws and develops one final distinction required to dismantle Meno's paradox, which again challenges the possibility of all theoretical teaching and learning. The distinction is none other than Aristotle's own in his response to Meno's paradox, namely the contrast between something's being known absolutely, Greek haplos, the Arabic ala itlaq, versus its being known universally, the Greek kathalu, the Arabic kuli. Now, Avicenna glosses the distinction as one between being known potentially, universal knowledge, and being known actually, absolute knowledge. Thus, for example, when one knows something universally, one potentially knows all the particular judgments that fall under that universal. In Avicenna's words, I quote, when there first comes to us, indana, a universal judgment, whether it is obvious in itself, as for example, all humans are animals, and the whole is greater than the part, or proven through induction or methodic experience, according to the ways by which things are verified, non-syllogistically, then we already know the judgment of every particular under it potentially. Now, to clarify, Avicenna gives the example of, and this is his example, of our knowing Zaid, the Indian, is an animal. Avicenna insists that when one knows universally that all humans are animals, one does not actually know that Zaid is an animal. One merely knows Zaid's animality potentially. One comes actually to know that Zaid is an animal when one joins to the conceptualized universal statement, all humans are animals, two further pieces of knowledge. First, one must know that Zaid exists, that is the first order weather question, and second, that Zaid is something existing as a human, that is the second order weather question. So these are the weather questions. So Avicenna tells us that both of these two further pieces of knowledge, which are required if one is to go from potentially knowing to actually knowing, involve recognition, marifa. Now, for Avicenna, recognition is a complex mode of cognition involving two elements. First, a cognitive or intellectual component, and second, a sensory element. Now, Avicenna is adamant that sensation is neither the first nor even the primary element in recognition. There we go. The reason for Avicenna's stance is that he does not believe that it is enough merely to have some blind or absolute sensory experience to recognize something. As for example, that Zaid is an existent and that he is something existing as a human. One needs initially to know first, Zaid is what exists before us, and two, what exists before us is something existing as a human. In other words, for Avicenna, recognition is not merely sensibly experiencing that there is something, but sensibly experiencing something as such. So my little example here, apparently the monkey is seeing the TV, but he's not seeing a TV. He's just having a box experience, whereas the child here is seeing it as a TV. Okay. So the monkey's seeing that there's something there, but not seeing it as a TV. So moreover, one can only sensibly experience something as such if one has conceptualized the first and second order what questions, that is, what the term means and what the true nature of the thing is. Thus, to recognize something, one must sensibly experience that thing as such. And one can only experience something as such if one first has the conceptualization of whatever that thing is. In short, for Avicenna, there is at least one sense that knowledge is prior to sensory experience, at least in recognition, at least in teaching and learning, namely in conceptualizing what a thing is. And I'm got a little bit more here. I'm sorry, I'm running a bit behind. Okay, so we can now consider Avicenna's full solution to Meno's paradox. Again, the paradox claims that cognitive or intellectual teaching and learning are impossible. For either we seek to know what we already know, and so there is no need to seek it, or we seek to know what we do not already know, and so we would not recognize what we sought even if we came across it. Now, according to Avicenna, the first horn, namely the impossibility of seeking what we already know, has force only if we already know what we seek in every respect, for indeed there would be nothing else to learn and seek. Similarly, the second horn, namely the impossibility of seeking what we do not already know, has force only if we are ignorant of what we seek in every respect, for we would not even know to seek something or what it is that we seek. These states of absolute complete knowledge and absolute complete ignorance, however, are not the case, continues Avicenna. For prior to seeking a piece of knowledge, we are knowers in two respects, while we are ignorant in one respect. The two respects in which we have prior knowledge are, one, that we have a piece of knowledge qua some actual conceptualization of what the thing is, and two, in possessing that piece of knowledge, we have an additional piece of knowledge qua some potential verification of it, either whether it is or why it is and that it is, and we have a piece of universal knowledge. Now, as for the respect in which we are ignorant, we do not yet have the actual verification of it. We do not know it absolutely. Now, more specifically, prior to investigation, we actually know some object of inquiry, and so we can actually conceptualize the first order what question. We have something that tells us what this thing is. As such, we actually possess some initial description for what the object of inquiry names, which is potentially verifiable. In some cases, Avicenna goes on, we just by happenstance recognize that something fits this description, while in other cases, we have to actively seek and test a thing, talab, empty hand, and it's the word to test, in order to recognize whether it fits this description, and in so doing, we come to recognize it. Seeking and testing here are just constructing proofs and arguments based upon our initial descriptions, and then going out and observing in order to actually verify, first, that something indeed does exist, and then second, that it exists as described. So let me conclude and summarize by indulging in a bit of an anachronism. Avicenna's solution to Meno's paradox involves a particular scientific method. That method has us begin by 1, identifying or formulating some question. Next, 2, we hypothesize, wada, some initial answer to our question. And then 3, see if there is some sufficient evidence to justify further inquiry. If there is sufficient evidence, we 4, analyze and refine our initial answer. And then 5, test it again. And only thereafter do we apply our hypothesis to additional problems and questions in science. Perhaps the above is not exactly our modern scientific method, although I should add that Avicenna does develop something like a theory of experimentation, tajriba, in the Book of Demonstration. He nonetheless is suggesting that at least something akin to the scientific method is the best response to Meno's paradox.